Hey guys, it's Jenna. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm doing my fall wrap up and I will be talking about all of the books that I read in October and November. There are 12 of them in all, so I won't be going into too much detail about each of them because I do not want this video to be incredibly long. But I feel like I say that every time and it always ends up being at least over 10 minutes, but oh well. So I will be talking about 12 books total. Let's just get into them. The first book that I finished in October was Esperanza Rising by Pam Munoz Ryan. This is a middle grade story about a young girl, I believe she's 14, named Esperanza, and it talks about her and her family's journey as they live and work in a labor camp in California after being transported from Mexico. I read this when I was younger. It was actually one of my favorite books ever when I was a little girl. And then I had to reread it again for my multicultural literature for children class that I took this fall semester. And I really enjoyed it. I gave it 5 stars on this reread. And I would definitely recommend it if you're looking for a good middle grade historical fiction. Some beautiful writing in there. There were several passages where I felt like it was written like poetry. It was just so poetic and very deep for a middle grade novel. So if you are interested in some good middle grade, I would definitely check that one out. The next book that I read was The K by Theodore Taylor. Again, another middle grade novel. I would consider this a classic. I read this at my husband's urging because this is one of his favorite books ever, and it was a really short little book. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. It wasn't amazing for me. It's basically a survival story. So this boy who lives in the Caribbean, he ends up going on this ship. It takes place during World War II, and he's going on this ship to be transported to Florida, I believe. Goodness, it's been such a long time since I've read it. Anyway, the ship ends up sinking, and he ends up on this little island, or a cay, with this older gentleman, and they wind up it just tells the story of them trying to survive on this little cay, and there's a hurricane, and there's just crazy survival things happening. So it was a cute little story. It didn't wow me. There wasn't a lot of descriptions of the characters, and for such an exciting premise, I felt like not a lot happened. I really just wanted a little bit more. It just felt short and not very descriptive as far as like details go. So I did end up giving it 3 stars. However, if you're looking for a good, exciting, classic story, you might want to pick this one up. But again, it didn't really wow me. But I am glad that I read it because it's one of my husband's favorite books from his childhood. And I also plan on making it my book of the month for my middle grade book club that I run at work. The next book that I read was It by Stephen King. I ended up giving this 5 stars. If you want to know my detailed thoughts on it, definitely check out my It reading vlog that I did. It's like over 20 minutes long, and I share a lot of my thoughts on it. So I will just link that down below. But I will just say in this video that I ended up loving it. It had its problems, and I acknowledge those problems. It was just a strange, weird, amazing journey reading that book, and I thought it was a masterpiece, so I gave it 5 stars. The next book that I read, another middle grade for my class, it was called The Turtle of Oman by Naomi Shihab Nye. I think that's how you pronounce it. I gave it 3 stars. It's about a little boy living in Oman, and it follows his mental journey as he prepares to move to America. And not a lot happens in this book. A lot of the people in my class ended up enjoying it more than I did. I did think it was sweet, and it explored our main character's relationship with his grandpa as they're trying to say goodbye to each other before he moves to America. So I thought that was touching and sweet. But again, it didn't really wow me. It was just a cute, okay middle grade novel, in my opinion. The next book that I read was Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. And I ended up giving this 4 stars. I sped through this. 1, because it's contemporary. It was really easy to get through. And 2, because of his writing. You've probably heard a lot about this book recently. It's been popular on BookTube ever since it came out. John Green is extremely popular. I ended up liking the writing, but nothing about it stuck with me whatsoever. I ended up giving it 4 stars because I really like John Green's writing and his storytelling and how much depth that he gives to his characters. But it's, I don't know, I almost want to change my rating from a 4 star to a 3.5 because I can't really remember that much about it. Our main character, her name is Aza, and she struggles with thought spirals. So she does have OCD, and this book would be considered own voices because John Green himself has OCD. So it was very interesting to get inside Aza's mindset when it comes to these thought spirals and how she deals with them and how she lives her life, like shapes her life around these thought spirals and how she herself can get out of them. That was interesting to read about. But mostly I walked away feeling like it was just another YA contemporary. I always feel like I'm left wanting more at the end of a contemporary. They usually lack depth for me. But this one I felt was rather good for a contemporary, mainly because it was John Green and he puts so much depth into these teenage characters to the point where they're almost unrealistic in my opinion. But I did enjoy it. So if you're looking for an engaging contemporary with some depth and talks about mental health, I would recommend that. The next book that I read was Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, the illustrated edition. And this was my first time reading this book ever. If you have been following me and my channel for a while, you will know that The Prisoner of Azkaban was the only Harry Potter book that I hadn't read. For whatever reason, when I was little, I skipped over that book. I remember reading it about like a quarter of the way through and then putting it down, thinking that I didn't have to read the rest because I had seen the movie so many times, which is ridiculous, but somehow it happened and I ended up just skipping over the rest of the book. So I had made it a goal for myself, a specific goal for me in 2017 to read The Prisoner of Azkaban, and I finally did it, and of course I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. It's a little hard for me to say, like, if I think, like, it's hard for me to say like which Harry Potter book is my favorite because now I've read them like out of order, and I've never reread the other books. So I'm thinking about doing a reread of the series next year or maybe the year after that, sometime relatively soon, because I'd like to read them in consecutive order again now that I've finally officially completed the series. I don't know if any of that made sense, but I read it. Finally, I gave it 5 stars because it was, of course, fantastic. The next book that I read was Jane Steele by Lindsay Fay. I ended up giving this 4 stars. I think I might end up giving this 3.5 in the end. I thought that I would love this. I thought that I would end up giving this book 5 stars. It's basically a retelling of Jane Eyre. Basically, like it's not actually a retelling, it's kind of inspired by Jane Eyre, and I just thought it was kind of strange. Like it's inspired by Jane Eyre, but it's not a retelling, but it is. And the main character, Jane Steele, is enamored with the story of Jane Eyre, and she kind of aspires to be like Jane, only she is a serial killer. And the premise sounds extremely interesting and I thought I would love it, but the way that it was executed, I felt like there was something missing. I feel like if you're going to be a retelling, just be a retelling. Don't be kind of inspired by it and have your character reference it, but then not really say why they love Jane Eyre. Like, it was never fully explained why she likes Jane Eyre so much. And I needed more backstory and how she feels like she's connected to Jane Eyre. Like, why is Jane Steele so similar to Jane Eyre? I don't know. And then why does her life follow Jane Eyre's so much? Like, if it's not a retelling, like, I don't know. It was a little bit weird for me. Like, it was riding the line between a retelling and not a retelling, whereas I felt like it should just pick one and run with it. I don't really know if that makes a whole lot of sense, but I don't know. I wanted more from it. I did end up really liking the writing. It took me a little bit to get into, but I ended up liking it. I mean, I gave it 4 stars initially. That's not a bad rating. I just felt disappointed by it for whatever reason. I think it was just trying to be Jane Eyre, but at the same time, it wasn't trying to be Jane Eyre. It's like, I don't know, just pick one. If it's gonna be a retelling, like, let it be a full retelling. But I don't know. It was just all right. Again, I might change it to 3.5 stars. The next book that I read and absolutely loved was Anne of Green Gables by L.N. Montgomery. This was my first time reading Anne of Green Gables, and I fell in love with Anne. I fell in love with Green Gables and Avonlea. After finishing the book, I watched the Anne with an E Netflix series, and I really liked that, although it kind of took a darker turn in my opinion. And then after that, I watched the Megan Follows adaptation, the movie that was made in the 80s, I believe. I'm not really familiar with it, my first time watching it, but I absolutely loved it. And it's just a wonderful story. You are most likely familiar with the plot, but it's just about an orphan girl named Anne who is taken in by this aging brother and sister who own a farm called Green Gables in Canada on Prince Edward Island, and it is just touching and hilarious and super dramatic and sweet. I just absolutely loved it, and I cannot wait to read the rest of the series. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it yet. The next book that I read and really, really enjoyed was The Adventurers Guild by Zach Lauren Clark. This is another middle grade fantasy novel. It just came out this year, and it had really good reviews on Goodreads, and I ordered it from my library because it is a book that's inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. And one of the main characters is a half elf. So his mom is a human, but his dad was an elf. And I'm actually working on my own book, which it's very slow progress. But one of my main characters is also a half elf. And my book is also inspired by a campaign that I was involved in Dungeons and Dragons. So I was like, no way, I have to read this book just for enjoyment and also kind of for research as well, just to see how another author executed that concept. So I read it and I loved it. It was super good. The writing was very engaging. The characters, which were like teenagers, and it was just so fun and action-packed, and the world was extremely rich, and I believe it's going to be a series. I can't wait to read the next installment in this story following these characters. But I really, really highly recommend it if you're in the market for a middle grade fantasy that's not too high of fantasy, but is inspired kind of by high fantasy. Like, it takes place in a high fantasy world, I would say, but it's very accessible, and I just really, really liked it. I would highly recommend The Adventurers Guild. The next book that I read was A Darker Shade of Magic. I finished this in November, so the last couple books I finished in November. And this is my first Victoria Schwab book. I buddy read this with Robin over at the Driftless Reader and Kelsey over at Hardback Haven, and we are having such a blast. Actually, we're reading the whole series together. We just finished A Gathering of Shadows, and we're having a lot of fun reading this together. I really enjoyed it. I'm super glad that I finally started reading Victoria Schwab. It's epic and different and unique and so fun, and the world is so engaging. I love the magic, I love the characters, there are a lot of unanswered questions at the end of the first book that I was hoping to get the answers to in the second book, but the second book has only given me more questions that I need answers to. So, but more on that later in my December wrap up. But I ended up really loving A Darker Shade of Magic. It is worth the hype, I would say. I didn't quite give it 5 stars. I ended up giving it 4.5 officially. But I definitely highly recommend it. Like, the hype is real. The next book that I read was The Birch Bark House by Louise Erdrich. I again read this for my multicultural lit for children class, and I ended up giving it 3 stars. I think it was my favorite book that I read for this class. It follows a Native American girl, and it basically follows a year in her life with her family, and some of the things that they go through are very traumatic. Smallpox ends up invading their village and they have to deal with that, and it just follows a year in their lives, and our main character goes through a really defined character arc and transformation to where at the end she just reaches this place of becoming very comfortable in her own skin, which I really enjoyed. I gave it 3 stars, not because I disliked it, but just there were some aspects of it that I wanted more from. Like, it was told kind of like a fairy tale in that we don't get a lot of details as to the characters' thoughts and feelings. It was just a story being told, like, this happened then, that kind of thing. So it felt a little distant, and that's why I ended up giving it 3 stars. But I still would highly recommend. And it actually is the first in a series following this family's journey. So if you're interested, it is a series. The next book that the last book that I finished in November, and the last book that I will talk about in this video, is Since We Fell by Dennis Lehane. This is a mystery thriller, I would say. I ended up giving this 3 stars, 3.5. My feelings about it now, in this current moment, are that it was just okay. However, when I was reading it, I was very engaged. It pulled me along, and I felt like I did not want to put the book down because I just needed to find out what was happening in this book. It's an interesting one. There are 3 distinct parts to the book that are kind of related. And at the end, I was really hoping for those 3 distinct parts to be tied together a little better than they were. Our main character, Rachel, I think that was her name. Goodness, I feel like so out of it. I'm trying to remember these thoughts about these books. Our main character struggles with agoraphobia, and we see her go through this journey of accepting herself and learning how to cope with the symptoms that she struggles with, you know, relating herself to the outside world and becoming comfortable in her own skin. And we just follow that journey. I felt like it was really real and raw. It was interesting to read a main character with agoraphobia. I never read a kind of character like that before. So that was interesting, but at the end, I just wish it had wrapped up a little bit more nicely. It was all right. I did love the writing. I loved how engaged I was, but it was a little too long and a little too rambly. Like, it went off on a lot of tangents that I felt weren't all circled back around to later, if that makes sense. So those are all of the books that I read in October and November. I tried to keep my thoughts concise. I tried to talk a little bit faster so I could get through them all for you guys. Like I said, if you have any specific questions about any of these books, feel free to let me know down below, and I'd be happy to elaborate a little bit more. I'm excited to finally film this and catch up with you guys. And speaking of catching up, I think the next video that I'm going to be doing is a catch-up / discussion video where I share with you some thoughts that I've been having about BookTube. There's been a lot of discussion videos about BookTube going around recently, and while I don't have what I think to be anything new or unique to add to the conversation, I think I just need to get some thoughts out there and just kind of blah to you guys. Because it has officially been 1 year that I've been on BookTube. December 4th was my 1-year BookTube anniversary. And I had these plans to celebrate that by either like creating an original tag. I thought about doing that. Something that I've wanted to do this whole time that I've been on BookTube. So that may be in the works in the future. I still kind of want to do like a 2017 year in review video. Not really stats like per se, but just talking about my feelings about what I've been reading and things like that. I want to make some 2018 reading goals videos and stuff like that. There's so many things that I want to do in my head that I feel just kind of like paralyzed by indecision of what to do next. So I figured I'd just start off by catching up with a wrap up. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. This video did end up being over 20 minutes long, but I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts on the many books that I read and covered in this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Please give it a thumbs up if you did, and I'll see you next time. Bye.